Hello and welcome to Stories Read and Written by Ballerscheff. You're listening to An Ordered Life. If you'd like to read along to the stories as I read them, you can find a link to my blog in the description of this video. And as always, remember to like, share, and subscribe. Morris stood up from the park bench, got out his phone, and took pictures. 4 zoomed out of the bird sitting on the outermost and thinnest part of the tree branch. If the swallow's perch had snapped under its weight, which was unlikely unless the swallow really tried, but if it had happened, that part of the broken branch would be a twig, no bigger than his finger, really. The bird's tail, depending on how he looked at it, either separated into 2 tines of a fork, or, reversing directions, they came together to act as the back end of the swallow's dress coat. Its body was long, not round like the bodies of the younger swallows he'd seen, whose tails had outgrown the rest of them and hung largely unsupported. The swallow's throat was red, as was a good deal of the lower half and middle of its face. It was black from head to tail, and white from its feet up and along its breast. Its beak was like the black nib of a pen. How well the swallow coordinated its colors! Was each feather a different color entirely, or were those on the borderline, say where its throat ended and its breast began, a mix of what they stood between? If he somehow sedated the swallow and put it under a magnifying glass, or more realistically, if he sedated and then plucked a feather from every swath of color, what would he see in them? The swallow looked off into the distance for a purpose he couldn't discern, not by studying the bird itself, and not by squinting in the same direction to look for what could possibly be of interest to it. As far as he could see, its eyes were black beads, black and only black, but his eyes weren't as good as the bird's. Then came the close-ups. His phone's camera lens revealed what he had been too human to see with his naked eye. He took one shot of its head, one of its wings, and one of its feet. He felt he had captured the swallow in part and in whole. These projects helped him to live an ordered life. There was a time for what he had to do, and a time for what he wanted to do. When he took pleasure in going about his business, it was all the better for him. When they didn't, he pushed through and looked forward to what he liked. Every Friday he took painting classes at the rec center. His art was simple in its execution and in its ambition. He tried to paint what he saw as he saw it. When he tried to go beyond this phrase and the style it described, his limited ability brought him back down to earth. His ventures into other styles were interesting, but not as good as the realism he gravitated towards. He was a competent worker who tackled his paintings as a draftsman tackled a drawing of a machine and the components it's made of, although he didn't care about his subject's insides. Nature had built this bird to a certain specification. It was his job to describe its dimensions and what went with them. Despite his style, he did have some kind of a greater artistic yearning. He must have, to pick up painting after decades of not having touched a paintbrush since kindergarten, where he had gotten off to a good start. Painting was a hobby for him. It entertained and fulfilled him, and he wanted no more from it than that. If he had been offered a spot in a gallery, he would have accepted it. He'd have accepted every last bit of fame until it got to the point where he had to do interviews and explain his work. No, what was he saying? He'd take fame if he could get it and give them nothing in return, not unless he wanted to, and they couldn't make him. They might try, but he wouldn't. He flatly refused. He was irked by the possibility whenever it entered his mind, and would then square his shoulders and puff himself up as if to repel some impudent busybody. This, too, was part of how he ordered his life. His dearest principle was to not give an inch to those who weren't close to him. To his friends he was generous, and he was as helpful to strangers as society expected him to be. He gave his pocket change to beggars and donated the surplus of his fridge and pantry to food drives. Morris, upon meeting Wallace at the rec center for the first time and seeing his attempts at painting, had said Wallace had an artistic temperament. Wallace believed such a thing existed, and believed also that Morris was right in saying he had it. To give the idea some ground to stand on, Wallace offered proof, the best of which was that his thoughts came to him like specks passing over his eye, completely without his say-so, without him being able to stop them. That's not how I do it, Morris said, intent on showing why Wallace was naturally better than him. I get at it like anything else. First the main thing, and then the rest. I did the bridge and the stream running under it, and now I'm doing the people. He adjusted his canvas so Wallace could see it. The perspective of his painting was at a distance from its subject. The bridge and the stream stretched from one end of this painting to the other, too much for the boundaries of the canvas to hold. Morris had painted the people on the bridge in miniature, their faces flesh-colored smudges beside daubs of other colors that were meant to suggest their clothes. No less than 3 of his figures wore scarves, a number Wallace congratulated him on. To dress his figures up, Morris had used the smallest brush at his disposal, whose point was the size of a pinhead and produced strokes of the same sort, and bent over his painting at an angle that he'd eventually learned to avoid for the sake of his neck. Morris watched Wallace to study his painting and realized how little he had really explained for how much he had said. He gave it another go at a new angle and tried to define himself by what he wasn't and what Wallace was. He looked to Wallace's painting for inspiration and saw an austere man whose face was flatter than most people's, almost perfectly flat if you could look at him in profile, except for his nose and the dips and rises that formed his chin and thin slit lips and small forehead. The rest of the canvas was an unpainted white, except for the lower right-hand corner. There, Wallace had painted a lone block of color, a mix of hazy black and red, like a fire seen through smoke. When the portrait was done, Wallace said, he would expand that block to fill the painting's empty space, fit it around the man, and have that be the background. Wallace, Morris theorized, paid close attention to how people looked, as well as how they moved, something that was as visible in a still image as the rest of a person. The man of the painting sat in a chair, his right arm on the armrest, his left arm in his lap. Morris could very well imagine how the man might get up if he chose to do so. Wallace blushed. He doesn't exist, he confessed, shaking a little from laughter he had a hard time containing. I made him up, pure invention. Wallace was good at steadying his voice and calming the avoidable signs of an emotional reaction. His face, then, was the first and the surest sign with which to gauge his mood. The nature of his painting was in this case a sensitive subject for him, because he liked to be complimented and hated having to tell Morris how undeserving he was of such high praise. I guess you really fooled me then, huh? Morris said. Their talk irritated the other students, who outnumbered the pair by 10. Of those 10, it took one student to shush them. The whole dozen sat arranged in a circle, each with an easel in front of them. What the others painted, neither Wallace nor Morris cared to know, though they sometimes caught a glance of somebody's canvas by accident. The teacher intermittently stood up from his own easel to check how much progress his students had made since his last go-round. He was unobtrusive, keeping his words and movements to a minimum as he dispensed tips and advice, allowing himself to be overlooked for the sake of maintaining a near total productive silence in the classroom. He'd swoop in, make a mental note, and keep it to himself until the time came that the student in question needed to know what he thought. Students who wanted help raised their hands, which Morris rarely did. If their teacher thought you didn't need his help, he'd let you tire yourself out waiting. He told his students there were no stupid questions, but there were questions that were better solved with boredom and introspection than by bothering him needlessly. That was a good rule to live by. as Morris had done even before he had attended these classes and had heard his thoughts so concisely expressed by another. And to be content with boredom and with his thoughts gave him something to do wherever he was. He and Wallace were supposed to have a late lunch today at a restaurant by the waterfront. It was 5 minutes past 3 o'clock, and Wallace wasn't there. Morris checked his texts, both the old, those with which he and Wallace had hashed out a time and a place to meet, and the new, which were few and unimportant. None of them were from Wallace. Oh well, he was where he should be. He aimed his phone back at the swallow. The swallow shifted in its spot as if it were posing, when really it was planning its flight. Morris was very good at finding uses for the useless, including dead time. At the doctor's office, he pored over the magazines in the waiting room. Faced with a late train, as it seemed he was more often than the average person, he engaged those around him in speculation on what the reason behind the delay could be. He took all comers. Each theory was as good as the next, at least until the train arrived, which was no guarantee of a sure answer. Morris lowered his phone, keeping his eyes trained at the swallow, and waited for it to make some noise. A chirp, a warble, a cry, if its lungs were up to it. It was scared, he thought, scared of the people it saw and scared of him. He discovered the swallow's fear by blind intuition, a method that was quicker than rigorous thinking and also more fragile. With intuition, he had to jump at the first thought that came to him, take it all the way to its conclusion, and had to do it from a standstill, with no run-up or preparation. If he hesitated, slowed down, or stopped, he'd start thinking rationally, and his thoughts could then be picked apart by doubt, and would have to stand on their own legs, rather than be steadied by his preconceptions. The thought he'd had about the swallow's eyes scurried across his mind, making a mad dash for its nearest hiding place, and failed to reach it before it was checked by Morris's self-scrutiny. No, he thought, he was wrong. What could the swallow be afraid of? He hadn't chased after it like it was a pigeon. He was reading too much into its eyes, was confusing instinct for emotion, or what was, at best, behavior learned because it was conducive to survival. It was like how parents talk in gibberish to their babies, cooing in a high pitch that no other situation in their lives calls for. Some parents don't ever wean themselves off of that. Morris had talked that way with his friends' children, having none of his own. They were fun as long as you didn't have to care for them and everything that entailed. What prevented him from taking that tone with the children he saw around them was that they were strangers. Some parents pushed their babies in strollers and made their older children hold their hands and walk beside them as he had as a boy. Some parents put their dogs on leashes, and their kids too. He'd seen such devices in department stores. That was how he learned of their existence. Wallace had no dogs and one son, who had outgrown his leash if he had worn one at all. There was a joke about such people he remembered hearing in private, a safe distance from anyone at whose expense the joke might be. He couldn't remember it now, and that was good. There was no chance of him blurting it out accidentally, and an equally low chance of him seeing these people again in any of the circles he traveled in, which he guessed with one look at each person in question didn't much or often overlap. He looked at the swallow's most distinguishing features to determine whether it was native. He suspected that it wasn't, unable to say why exactly. The swallow was here for the summer and migrated to the then more bearable and warmer Africa for the winter. Which region it went to, and how near to the equator and to the Sahara it liked to be, that he didn't know. He had seen the comings and goings of various birds, and taken photos of them all, and from them he had made his best paintings. He worked on each for weeks, taking it as a challenge to replicate them down to the most minute detail, exactly as his camera's eye and as his own had seen them. He also mapped the migration patterns of the birds he photographs. He also mapped their migration patterns. He had thought of ways to show this in the paintings themselves, but none of his ideas had come to fruition. Morris preferred to paint nature over people, birds in particular. It was impersonal. Wallace had sat for a portrait once as a favor, and the affair was so uncomfortable for the both of them that Morris didn't return the favor by sitting for Wallace, who forgave his friend for not upholding his end of the bargain. They had gone into Morris's backyard because his house lacked a proper studio. The grass would absorb the paint with less mess than his carpet, and the open sky gave them more natural light than his windows did. Morris, workmanlike, had made a rough sketch of Wallace sitting on the stool he had brought outside. Then Morris defined the outline of his body and filled in the details, going up from Wallace's shoes and getting no further than his knees. Morris focused on one bit of Wallace's body at a time, and when he was finished with that, his eyes flicked about in search of the next step. When his eyes met Wallace's, he looked away. He didn't like to see Wallace move. It made Morris feel Wallace was getting restless and losing patience with him. He considered taking a photo of him and using that instead of the real thing, but he wanted to see this through. Wallace found Morris's intense stare so absurdly comic that he couldn't help but laugh and break Morris's concentration. If everything had gone right and Morris completed the portrait, it might still have presented a problem. Whom did it belong to, and where should the owner put it? Say the painting stayed with Morris, who had intended it as a gift for Wallace in return for being his model. Should he hide it in the attic where nobody could see it? His talent was nothing to boast about and nothing to be ashamed of. Should he hang it in the living room and have Wallace's eyes on him at all times? And if Wallace took it, where could he hang a portrait of himself and not look laughably self-impressed to all his friends, except the one who had painted it? By breaking the session off as he had, Morris did away with these difficulties. The people Morris chose to paint were those whose faces he caught at a glance and remembered vividly. Memory, he knew, decayed with time, so he took great care to complete his portraits of strangers that had struck him on the day that he saw them, while their faces were fresh, and once painted, so they'd stay. For his purposes, his memory was about as good as a shoddy camera, which begs the question whether he'd have put a real camera in a stranger's face, if the one in his head was worse than it was. His latest subject was a woman in a fur coat, whose red hair accentuated her pale face, and vice versa. He'd seen her 10 days ago, while on a walk he'd taken for the sake of some fresh air. He had shown Wallace his painting of her 9 days ago, when Wallace came over to see him. "It looks good," Wallace said. "Isn't it?" Faced with a compliment, Morris could think of nothing but to agree with it. "Now that I've seen your painting, I could see that woman walk by me on the street and believe she was real. Let's go for a walk. She might turn up twice." They went to the square where Morris said he'd seen her, and found nobody there but themselves. They chatted and waited, and when nobody came to join them, they left with a disappointment that was no greater than the small hope it came from. When that hope was dashed, they shrugged and went on their way. They found a restaurant, ate well, and talked at length, nearly forgetting the pale-faced woman. Wallace told him about his short-lived career as a magazine illustrator. Morris responded with further questions until he squeezed all Wallace knew about illustration out of him. Morris was eager to understand, and not anxious or envious of Wallace for having started painting earlier than he himself had. It was something Morris had never agonized over, but the thought of such feelings emerging had stopped him from taking the Rex painting class sooner than he had. He worried that he'd lose interest, after he saw how much better the others were than him, a fear that, in hindsight, became ludicrous as he realized he was firmly in the middle of his class. The first hour he and Wallace spent together proved as much, an error Morris happily accepted. He closed what gap in artistry there was to speak of between the two of them within mere months, practically not worth mentioning. Their friendship began at these classes, and as it came into its own, it became extracurricular. Something about meeting Wallace today brought the matter of the pale-faced woman back to Morris's mind and made him want to tie up loose ends. Just as Morris thought about calling Wallace to ask him what was taking so long, he heard Wallace call his name, turned around, and call it back. They had found each other. The park was a minute's distance from the restaurant. They sat inside so that they were spared the lingering smell of the recent rainstorm, which had taken with it the wind they now wished would come again. The town wants a mild sweeping, a clean slate, Morris said. Not a strong wind and a worse mess. The town had little to fear. The land was flat, but not vulnerable to tornadoes. The houses were sturdy and easily rebuilt if and when the wind knocked them down or caved them in with a bit of debris. Morris looked out the window at the sea and found that there, too, everything had its place. The wind is picking up, he said. The waterfront was blue. The water where the container ships docked was an uglier color. Though they were part of the same sea, the two never met because they were far apart. You could count on the sea to be calm. Storms were so infrequent that, when they did happen, they came as a mild shock to residents and tourists alike, a break in the routine that reminded them of their good days or the result of luck that could quickly turn around. That's what the weatherman predicted, Wallace said, meaning a gentle breeze. And who knows it better than them, said Morris. He didn't know what Wallace meant, since there had been too long a pause between what Morris had said and then what he had thought and Wallace's response. His voice quavered. He took on an unnatural tone, unsure whether he wanted to be ironic about this. He had to have some bit of belief in weathermen, or he'd trust what he saw outside his window and no more. Had the weatherman's predictions been worse than a gentle breeze, Morris would have had to board up his house and tie down what the storm might take, make it stormproof. Tie down what the storm might take to make it stormproof. A word that was too short for all it meant. The storms always seemed to come in the most unpleasant seasons, all four of them. In the summer, it was too hot to work. God knows how the storm did it, and God knows how Morris managed, in spite of the breaks he took to breathe and to wipe his sweat away. Spring was no better, the same punishment, albeit given with less severity. In winter, temperatures fell below what was comfortable, whatever that was for him, and stayed above snow. A perfect zero would have cooled off any storm that might form. Any storm in the making. A perfect zero would have cooled off any storm in the making, and that was why he sometimes thought it didn't happen, to spite him. Other people were casualties in the weather's grudge match against him. He wore a coat to ward off the cold, and worked up less of a sweat than he did in summer. When he was finished or almost there, he unzipped his coat to let the air in, a preliminary to his shower. Wallace's neighbors, who, like him, lived on the coast, would have had to do the same work, and without Morris's help at that. It went like this. A neighbor, seeing the two men at work, told them they could secure the other houses when they'd finished with Wallace's. Morris's lips tightened, which the joker mistook for a smile. It wasn't that funny. What amused Morris was the impertinence of asking him, a friend of their neighbor, for that much help. It didn't matter if the question was serious or not. It was stupid either way. That mistaken smile was where Morris left it at most of the time. If he was feeling funny that day and had a joke to fire back with, he'd do so. "We've got our hands full here," he'd say. That invited a reply. "They look empty from here," Wallace's neighbor would respond. Morris might then, to make a show of it, grab the nearest thing that had to be brought inside and counter with, "Well, they aren't." Had storms been in season and had a neighbor tried that with him as of late, he'd have looked the man straight in the face with nothing but weariness in his eyes and turned back to his work as if he hadn't heard him. Morris swore he would. If, however, it was some old woman who asked for their help, and if she couldn't be left to help herself, they'd pitch in. That had never happened, and so, like other hypotheticals he imagined, it amounted to nothing. He could keep the first promise better than the second, because his scowl and accompanying stare would come to him automatically. He didn't feel funny these days. His willingness for such a back and forth with any random idiot that forced himself on him had been slim before and was now non-existent. Morris had settled into glumness and irritability, using his age, that decades of exposure to the sun had marked into his face, as an excuse. He disliked unnecessary talk, and what was necessary was what he liked to hear, mainly himself and Wallace, with some rare exceptions. "The worst storm I can remember," Wallace said. "I don't mean to say it's the worst. Just what I can remember was 2 years ago." Then he added, "in February, though it might have been January." That's how Wallace said it, exactly as I've written it. February. He pronounced the silent R as clearly as the rest of it, so that it protruded from the word like a bump in the road, and caught Morris's attention. It was by no means a harsh sound, and the word as a whole was as soft as any other that passed from Wallace's lips. Morris noticed this quirk, God knows when, long enough ago for him to forget it anyway, and had given it some thought. Only now did he ask Wallace about it. "I don't mean to be nosy," Morris apologized. He spoke in a hushed tone that signaled his own embarrassment, just as it sought to minimize Wallace's by asking for forgiveness up front. Wallace was befuddled, lifting his eyebrows and wrinkling his forehead as he thought how best to approach the question. "That's just how I talk, I guess. That's how my family talks, and I include my parents and grandparents in that too," he said finally. He was at a loss for words. What he said and how he spoke had never needed to be explained. How he spoke was self-evidence. Why he spoke that way wasn't important to him. With no sign of holding a grudge for so much as a second, Wallace reached the subject of what he'd been working on lately. A series of portraits of his son. "Can he sit still for that long?" Morris asked. He certainly hadn't shown himself capable of that when Morris last visited. He can. He can. I don't ask too much of him. Besides, they're not all portraits in the classical sense, with him sitting down somewhere and folding his hands till it's over. I let him move around, do what he wants, and we take our time." "And how is he otherwise?" Morris asked. With that, they moved on to family matters. Wallace had little to say. "The family's fine, getting along and getting ahead. And what should I tell them about you?" Morris was well known in the Stevenson household, to Wallace and Marjorie as a good friend, and to their son, in his younger years, as uncle. Wallace, having no brother, let him have that title, and teased Morris and his nephew about it when the latter was old enough to understand. "Give them my regards and well wishes," Morris said. When they'd talked and eaten as much as they liked, they paid for their half of the bill and went for a walk to aid their digestion. Their cars were both in a nearby parking garage. "We'll get there," Wallace said, "but we'll take the scenic route." Usually they met at each other's houses, but today they didn't want to be bothered by the hassle that came with that. The convenience of a restaurant was well worth paying for from time to time. Whatever convoluted path Wallace was taking, it went through the square where Morris had seen the pale-faced woman. "Do you see her?" Wallace asked, trying to establish this as a running joke. No, Morris didn't, and he didn't know who Wallace meant. Wallace reminded him. "That woman you saw. You showed me her painting." "Oh, no, she's not there. Why would she be?" 10 days weren't enough to change the kind of night they got. The sky warned that, though it wasn't dark, it soon would be. It was an eerie half-darkness that came nearer to completion with every minute that passed. This was the light Morris had seen on the woman's face, and which had so fascinated him, an effect that, as well as saw it for himself on the faces of the people that passed them. On the face of the people that walked by. He recognized from Morris's painting. While Wallace was distracted, Morris took a photo of him and of his look of recognition. Their talk of portraits had reminded him of his own ill-fated attempt. He wanted to remedy that, to work on a second portrait in secret and present Wallace with it as a gift when it was up to Morris's standards. When the sky was finally dark, a spell of sorts fell over them. Morris and Wallace continued to talk, though more quietly than they had in the restaurant or during their stroll as the sun was setting. Neither of them wanted to be nuisances. Their words came to them slowly and went out at the same speed. What they said, however, was bolder, because they knew there was little danger of them being overheard. The lights of the houses and the restaurants either came on or had already been on and grew brighter, that is to say, more visible, in the night that surrounded them. "See that woman over there, on the other side of the street?" Wallace's hands stayed in his coat pockets as he said this. Morris looked. There were two women walking beside each other. She, Wallace said, had a paunch that made her seem to be smuggling something under her clothes. Hearing this, Morris realized he meant the woman on the outermost part of the sidewalk. He could hardly see the woman beside her. So who else could Wallace be making fun of? It was a mean joke, but Morris smiled, and because Wallace likely couldn't see it, he pretended to laugh. He studied Wallace until Wallace got sick of the scenery and circled back to the parking garage. They said goodbye, and by then, Morris believed he could have painted every inch of him, with or without a photo. That was An Ordered Life, written and read by Philip Ballerscheff. Again, if you'd like to read along to these stories from my blog, you can find a link to that in the description of this video. And as always, remember to like, share, and subscribe.